Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Newman Center. And welcome to our second of the Faith and Reason lecture series this evening, which is a Vocation of the Christian in Public Life, that will be presented by Mr. David Mulroney. And finally now, it's my pleasure to introduce the main person for this evening. Mr. David Mulroney is the president of the University of St. Michael's College and a distinguished senior fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. He served as the Ambassador of Canada to the People's Republic of China from 2009 to 2012. Prior to his appointment to Beijing, Mr. Mulroney was assigned to the Privy Council office in Ottawa as the Deputy Minister responsible for the Afghanistan Task Force, overseeing interdepartmental coordination of all aspects of Canada's engagement in Afghanistan. He also served as the Secretary to the Independent Panel on Canada's Future Role in Afghanistan, also known as the Manley Panel. Mr. Mulroney's other assignments included serving as the Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and concurrently as the Prime Minister's personal representative to the G8 Summit. Immediately prior to that, he served as Foreign and Defence Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada. A career Foreign Service officer, Mr. Mulroney has had a series of senior appointments in the Foreign Affairs Department in Ottawa, including 4 years as Canada's senior official for Asia-Pacific Cooperation. He served on overseas assignments in Taipei, Kuala Lumpur, Shanghai, and Seoul. From 1995 to 1998, he was the Executive Director of the Canada-China Business Council. Mr. Mulroney is a graduate of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto. He joined Foreign Service in 1981 and participated in full-time Mandarin training at Canadian Forces Language School in Ottawa. Mr. Mulroney, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sonal, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And let me just start before I begin my remarks, because our tradition at St. Michael's is very North American and very cross-border. I'd like to wish any Americans with us tonight a very happy Thanksgiving. I know you can't be with all of your families, but please consider us your family for this evening. So I've been looking forward to this talk for a long time, and for a number of good reasons, one of which I'll try to make clear in a moment. But I've also been worrying about it. The vocation of a Christian in public life is as important as it sounds. The fact is that I will not, indeed cannot, bring to it the discipline, learning, and appetite for ambiguity and complexity of a theologian. And I wish we'd put that in the poster. Mine is the somewhat more risky perspective of the practitioner, who tries to discern meaning and purpose by looking over his shoulder, effectively reinterpreting the past. Since much of the material I'll be reflecting on is drawn from my own experience, it will also be a bit personal. Of course, if you want the really juicy personal details, you'll have to buy my book. Also, my Christian perspective is largely a Catholic perspective, delivered, if not with actual ecumenical expertise, at least with ecumenical intent. And finally, here's my spoiler alert. Let me speed to the bottom line for those of you who may have to leave early tonight. The vocation of a Christian in public life is to serve. It's a high calling, and one to which we must bring loyalty, energy, and integrity. But as is true for people of other faiths, and for people of no faith, the whole person serves. It is a secular calling, but the Christian brings to it convictions about those served and a rationale for the service itself that are profoundly important. There is a possibility that one's Christian perspective may not align with the service one's asked to perform. And in that case, for a Christian, the authority is not the Director General or the minister or even that somewhat amorphous creature called the public, but the conscience, rightly and properly informed as defined by the person whose name we celebrate in this Newman Center. This does not mean that the Christian public servant gets to substitute some privately conceived alternative service, ignoring the wishes of the democratic government he or she was called to serve. As I'll try to argue, the only acceptable option in these instances, which I pray remain infrequent, is conscientious objection. To invoke the greatest Catholic ever to serve in public life, I am the King's good servant, but God's first. As Father Chris, Sonal, and others know, this is a very special place for me. Not only am I deeply grateful for everything the Newman Center does, and not only do I see Newman as a valued and essential partner for St. Michael's, but I owe my very existence to this place. Now, I could be speaking metaphorically, using this place to mean the church as an abstract concept, or you might think that I mean this place symbolizes the influence of Cardinal Newman in my life, and both are quite true, but for tonight, this place simply means this place. I owe my existence to it because my parents were married here in 1952. My mother was a graduate of St. Michael's College and had been recruited right after the war to work at a job in Ottawa, which is where she met my father. Just what exactly she'd been recruited to do in an Ottawa that was then beginning to experience the anxiety of the Cold War was never made clear to us. All that she would say is that she had taken an oath, a promise, not to talk about it, and she never ever did. That can seem rather quaint and funny in our era of oversharing, when all promises are conditional, and when the very idea of keeping secrets has a slightly disreputable air. But my mother's thinking was shaped by her faith. The promise she made had required her to place her hand on a Bible, something that she would not have done lightly, or without thinking about the implications. Robert Bolt gets to the heart of this very scrupulous approach to oath-taking in his preface to A Man for All Seasons, his wonderful play about St. Thomas More, the King's good servant I referenced earlier. Bolt is trying to explain something that would seem inexplicable to a modern audience, namely that More, the most brilliant lawyer in England, chose to die rather than taking the easy expedient of placing his hand on a book and mumbling some words that he didn't believe. The explanation lies in the fact that, as Bolt tells us, More was a very Orthodox Catholic, and for him, an oath was something perfectly specific. It was an invitation to God, an invitation God would not refuse, to act as a witness and to judge. My mother was a woman of many parts, and like More, a very Orthodox Catholic. So her lifelong silence, while unusual by the standards of Facebook or the Kardashians, is not surprising. Of course, her Catholic sensibility shaped her views on far more than the importance of keeping her promises, especially her promises to God. It contributed to her strong sense of personal responsibility, of vocation. Although she wouldn't share anything about her work in Ottawa, she instilled in us a deep respect for the concept of service, a belief that, like her faith, connected her to my father. Years later, she would juggle the responsibilities of caring for a young family with the year-round demands of teaching and teachers' college, simply because the Sisters of St. Joseph, who had educated her, asked her to serve. Now, I'd like to tell you that the rest of the family cooperated, piously respecting my mother's secret, but quite the contrary. We pried and teased her about it endlessly. She slipped only once, when she explained a plot point in the movie Dr. Zhivago, something that strongly suggested that she'd been able to read the Russian script in the scene. Years later, at my mother's wake, I met a distinguished older woman who told me that she'd worked with my mother in Ottawa. Old temptations die hard, so I pressed. Had she worked in the same section as my mother? Oh no, she said, shifting her pearls. I wasn't with Barbara. I was in the section that read German prisoner of war mail. My father was even more focused on the concept of public service. The heroes he invoked were the politicians and public servants who had shaped and were shaping modern Canada, people of integrity, vision, and determination. The list was not exclusively Catholic, but it was entirely liberal. He had a lifelong reverence for Mackenzie King, an unshakable devotion that easily survived revelations of King's odd personal life. My father often talked about encountering King as the Prime Minister went about his daily errands on the streets of pre-war Ottawa, unaccompanied by any of the security personnel we take for granted today. A respectful greeting would be returned without further fuss or drama. The almost unrecognizable Ottawa of the 1930s and 40s, a time of competent and dedicated public service mandarins, working alongside equally competent and dedicated elected officials, symbolized for my father that quintessentially Canadian ideal of peace, order, and good government. So while each of my parents came at it from a slightly different perspective, both were committed to the notion of the successful and happy life as necessarily being fulfilled through service. Their refrain to my brother, my sister, and me was that God had given each of us a brain with the expectation that we would use it to do good, to serve. When this observation was leveled at me, I seemed to detect a slight quaver in the delivery. That's because I normally heard it after I'd done something that led both my mother and father to doubt whether I'd actually taken possession of a brain in the first place, and I gave them good reason to doubt. That I grew up in a Catholic family that valued the concept of service isn't particularly newsworthy. That was true of most Catholic families when I was growing up, and had been true for many decades prior to that. Another entire talk could be devoted to the history of Catholic social action and to the emergence of dynamic Catholic political leaders with the gradual emancipation and empowerment of the Catholic underclass in North America. Drive through the downtown core of any North American city, and the legacy of that engagement is evident in brick and stone, in block after block of hospitals, schools, senior centers, recreation complexes, and urban missions. If my own interest in public service was kindled by my parents, my interest in the Foreign Service came from two other sources. My great-aunt Viola was a pioneering woman in the almost exclusively male Department of External Affairs, rising from the administrative ranks to serve as vice-consul in Milan and Hong Kong. She was a force of nature, swimming and cross-country skiing into her 80s, and a constant presence at St. Bridget's Church, which ministered to her community, the working-class Irish in Ottawa's Lower Town. The other inspiration was and is my wife Janet, an intrepid traveler long before I knew her, and the daughter of a family that welcomed international students into their home as a byproduct of their genial, generous, and wonderfully Anglican conception of Christian charity. I dedicated my book about Canada-China relations to Janet, referring to her as the ultimate traveler. That's an accolade whose accuracy I wearily attest to as I follow her to dangerous neighborhoods the world over to survey edgy museums, the homes of obscure artists, and long-forgotten architectural gems. She's drawn to points of interest unknown even to Lonely Planet. Knowing I wanted to join the Foreign Service and actually getting into it are two different things. I wrote the exam twice, only getting an interview the second time. I made myself memorable by passing out in mid-sentence, my head making a rich thud as it hit the boardroom table. The surprised interviewers were kind enough to offer me a second chance. The key moment of round two was a judgment question, modeled around the fall of Cambodia, then a very recent memory. How would I manage the closing of an embassy in the face of general collapse and disorder? And what, in particular, would I do to protect the locally engaged staff? I recognize the question as being inspired by a New York Times article about an actual incident, one that would later be memorialized as the Killing Fields. I didn't attempt to offer a single comprehensive answer, but I did refer to the article and used it to outline some of the complexities a decision maker would have to deal with, and I got the job. A note to would-be diplomats: read widely and don't forget the New York Times. Let me remind you that we're still dealing with ancient history here. I entered government service a year after another Prime Minister Trudeau had memorably welcomed us to the 1980s. It was a very different world. Looking back, I can think of many developments that have contributed to that difference over the course of the last 35 years, but for the purposes of tonight's talk, I'll focus on two important and interrelated trends. The first is the decisive conclusion of the New Deal Great Society era of government activism, and what had been widespread faith in government as an agent of positive change, a necessary leveler. By the 1980s, people were being encouraged instead to put their faith in the workings of what was described as a free market. In this conception, citizens were redefined as taxpayers, disgruntled shareholders in the business of governance. Indeed, government performance began to be managed according to the measures familiar to the corporate world. Experience in business was seen as an advantage for holders of high office, and like shareholders in the private sector of that era, tax-paying citizens elevated cost-cutting to something like an end in itself. Government, usually described as big government, came to be seen as an impediment. As Ronald Reagan, who came to power in 1980, put it, "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." Here in Canada, my namesake famously promised that if elected Prime Minister, and he was, he would hand out to his public servants pink slips and running shoes. Running against the public service became a key to success in Margaret Thatcher's England and in Mike Harris's Ontario. And that call to arms continues to sound. Over recent years, our former Prime Minister warned Canadians about the RCMP, government scientists, and census takers, and in the recent election, described his party as a last line of defense against power-hungry bureaucrats. In the 1960s, politicians like the Kennedy brothers inspired America's best and brightest to set their sights on the Peace Corps, on reforming Washington, and on fighting for the underprivileged. By the 1990s, government service, with the exception of military service, was often seen as a refuge for those who couldn't make it elsewhere. That message wouldn't have resonated if it hadn't contained an element of truth. Absent dynamic leadership, public service can be too tolerant of mediocrity. And absent the balancing forces of the ballot box, the media, and civil society, government can invade space where it has no business, including religious and family space. But these problems are, I think, the exception, although an exception that is capable of stirring very strong emotions. So the notion that government's job is to level an otherwise uneven and unfair playing field was decisively dismissed, with predictable results. The market tends to enrich those who are most able to navigate its increasingly arcane workings. The rich did indeed get richer, but at the expense of a lower class whose disadvantaged status was reinforced by steadily diminishing access to healthcare, education, and employment, and steadily increasing access to the prison system. That these disadvantages were allowed to persist was in part due to successful messaging by the beneficiaries of the so-called free market system. This involved continuing to reinforce dubious promises of social mobility and continuing to demonize an other whose membership included immigrants, minorities, and lazy bureaucrats. The phenomenon I've described above was and is more virulent in the United States than in Canada, and as discouraging as it has been from time to time, its impact was blunted for me by the influence of gifted political leaders who shared an abiding belief in the positive possibilities inherent in public service. My list of heroes includes Flora MacDonald, Joe Clark, Michael Wilson, John Manley, Bill Graham, and Pierre Pettigrew. And the fact that a little more than a month ago, a government that ran against the public service was soundly defeated by a party that has an ambitious and activist agenda suggests that the pendulum may finally be swinging back. We'll see. My main point here is that challenges to one's Christian beliefs can come from the right side of the agenda as well as from the left. Policies that favor the wealthy at the expense of the poor, that demonize the prisoner, that close borders rather than open doors, and that ignore the very real damage we are doing to God's creation, run counter to Christian teaching and values. If I was pressed to identify a barbaric cultural practice worthy of a call to the tip line that the last government was proposing, I'd blow the whistle on denying health care to refugees. But that's not to deny the very real challenges introduced by the other major change that I want to identify. Just as over the last 35 years we've witnessed, and mainly from the right, a marked propensity to see life through an economic lens and to identify human beings primarily as taxpayers, shareholders, and consumers, we have seen a corresponding desire, in this case mainly from the left, to elevate the notion of individual choice as the single highest good imaginable. But just as the market isn't quite as free as its champions assert, choice isn't quite as widely available as its champions maintain. Choice is most readily available to the prosperous and the powerful. It is less of a possibility for the poor, prisoners, refugees, the infirm, the aged, or the unborn. In other words, what passes for choice is only on offer to a relatively small and privileged segment of the developed world. It is also often gained at the expense of someone else. One of the most compelling insights that Pope Francis offers in the encyclical Laudato Si is that our unbridled consumption, our selfish choice, comes at the expense of the poor through low wages and environmental degradation. Finally, such choice is rarely informed and more often completely untethered from any systematic analysis of broader moral and ethical considerations. What matters most is my passionate and somewhat tautological assertion that whatever I want to do is right because it corresponds with my desire to do it. And if you think you see a fundamental connection between these forces emanating from right and left, one celebrating the market and the other celebrating choice, you would, I'm pretty sure, be right. Both reflect a profoundly secular, materialistic, and individualistic view of life. The key question isn't so much what's right or wrong, but what's right or wrong for me. It was not always so. Although the government I joined in 1981 would have rightly described itself as entirely secular, the Canada that it served was much less so. Indeed, there was very little daylight between me and my new colleagues when it came to the most basic assumptions about right and wrong, beginning with the very possibility of speaking seriously about them as concepts that have meaning. This broad and readily discernible moral consensus was frequently reinforced by the great and the good in society, by the media and popular entertainment, and by codes of conduct, both written and unwritten. That it was also a time of hypocrisy, intolerance, and manifest unfairness is also very true. But while we have made great and welcome progress in many, many ways, this does not include banishing hypocrisy, intolerance, or unfairness. Put another way, we're simply hypocritical about, intolerant of, or unfair to different things. Worse, far, far worse, we've undermined, intentionally or otherwise, some of the bedrock assumptions about our humanity that have served as the foundation for our society. This evolution was harder for me to discern, in part because it took longer to become salient and consequential, and because I didn't encounter possible ethical and moral challenges as a Catholic public servant until I was more advanced in my career and dealing with more serious issues. In fact, the challenges that did become apparent to me didn't surface until the last 10 years of my career. Let me offer 3 anecdotes from that final decade that caused me to think that I was, as a Catholic public servant, entering unfamiliar terrain. In 2006, as Sonal mentioned, I was serving as the Foreign and Defense Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister. That is a nonpartisan public service job that requires the incumbent to ensure that the Prime Minister is getting solid professional advice on foreign and defense issues, untainted by the kind of departmental special pleading and self-interest that is often embedded in advice from Foreign Affairs, CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, and National Defense. At one point, I was asked to explain to the new government what was happening at the UN under the general heading of women's reproductive rights. Specifically, what was the Canadian delegation's policy agenda, and whom had we invited as outside expert advisors to help us? As I attempted to answer that question, I encountered a profound reluctance on the part of the Canadian public servants working on this file to share information, much less seek guidance from the new government that Canadians had elected. There was little appetite for possible new policy directions and little enthusiasm for consulting with groups whose advice our delegation might not agree with. This was often accompanied by efforts to discredit any groups with contrary, meaning pro-life, opinions as being professionally and intellectually suspect, an embarrassment among the largely like-minded international community the Canadian officials had grown used to working with. That I found this personally distressing as a Catholic is not the point here. My main concern was the fact that the foot-dragging was professionally unacceptable. One of the core principles that distinguishes, or should distinguish, the Canadian public service is what we refer to as democratic values. That means that we fully and faithfully serve whatever government Canadians choose at the ballot box, regardless of one's own preference. This is fundamental to a professional, non-partisan public service. This is not to deny the possibility of disagreement or contrary views. 2 other bedrock principles of the Canadian public service are fearless advice and loyal implementation. You are expected to offer your unvarnished professional views, but after that has been delivered, you are also expected to carry out, to the best of your abilities, what the democratically elected government of the day has decided to do. Conscientious objection is, or should be, an option. Stubbornly and sneakily substituting your own preferred policy choice is not. A second, somewhat similar example arose with the first suggestions that the Conservative government was serious about its pledge to appoint an ambassador for religious freedom. I was struck by the profound ambivalence with which the idea was greeted by some of my colleagues by some of my colleagues. Within the department, a number of people came up with the same surprising question. Would the government also be appointing an ambassador for atheism? It was as if the very idea of the ambassador and his or her office represented an unfair advantage offered to religious believers, as if religious freedom and religious believers weren't threatened in many parts of the world, and as if the protection of this freedom wasn't promised in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights drafted by John Peters Humphrey, a Canadian. For me, the litmus test of departmental seriousness about the office involved whether or not colleagues would actually build the defense of religious freedom into the context of Canadian human rights policy, whether they had the creativity and inclination to see it as an organic component of a comprehensive approach. There was no sign of such principled engagement in my last years in government. Anticipating the creation of the new office, the embassy in Beijing had designed a number of potential projects that would have allowed us to support the expansion of religious freedom in China. These were ecumenical in nature, involving partnership with struggling Buddhist, Muslim, and Christian communities. But once submitted, they simply disappeared into the black hole of Ottawa indifference. My sense is that the office of Ambassador for Religious Freedom, despite the quality of the incumbent, has not lived up to its potential. That's partly because of public service skepticism, but it's also because the Conservative government played into the worst fears of the bureaucracy by repeatedly blurring the lines between the secular and the confessional, running the office with an eye on Canadian politics and Canadian demographics. This willful confusion is not unknown in other parts of our diplomacy. Appointing an ambassador to the Holy See is a serious foreign policy decision, not a shout-out to Canadian Catholics. The incumbent advances Canadian interests, policies shaped by Canadian voters, which may at times bring our country into disagreement with the Holy See. Failure to do that and failure to live up to that is actually disrespectful to the Vatican as a serious international actor. The Canadian ambassador works for the government and people of Canada, a reality that, if fully realized in light of current policies, could actually make the job very difficult for a Catholic to perform. But I digress. The main lesson for me here is that there is an opportunity, one not yet fulfilled, to do something thoughtful and meaningful and absolutely central to our larger foreign policy objectives in defense of religious freedom. This requires the government and its public servants to think of religious freedom as a human right, as real and worthy of protection as, for example, freedom of expression and freedom of association. Note that these two examples involve public servants pushing back against the elected government, admittedly a conservative government, whose policy interests ran counter to their own on reproductive rights and the place of religious freedom in our human rights agenda. The next example is both different and more personal. My third vignette comes from my time as ambassador in Beijing. I was normally asked to sign off on projects that the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA, was undertaking with Chinese partners. CIDA was then in the process of winding down its program in an increasingly prosperous China. Its remaining focus was on the most marginalized, people who were falling between the cracks of the Chinese system. Not surprisingly, many of these people are Tibetan. One of the projects I was asked to approve involved the provision of training to sex workers, the idea being to make the people who were so identified safer in their work and to help them to avoid economic exploitation. I didn't bother to dispute questions of terminology, real and important as they are, but I did decline to approve the project, explaining that I thought that we, as a rich country, should be directing our efforts at ensuring that women had other options for supporting their families. Why not offer them more vocational training? But in addition to questioning this in policy terms, which was within my professional authority, if not in CIDA's view my competence, I added an additional element. I knew that CIDA headquarters would overrule my assessment in an area where I was clearly a layman. Indeed, my lifetime record in raising similar objections with CIDA was something like 0-38. What I added was that my conscience wouldn't allow me to sign on to the project in any event, whatever headquarters ultimately decided. It seemed to me absurd and wrong that we would so cavalierly translate ideas being debated in the policy salons of Toronto and Vancouver into the lives of single mothers struggling for survival in windswept villages on the Tibetan Plateau, ideas that would, in my view, rob them of their human dignity. My rejection was taken in stride and the project was rerouted through an alternative approval process. But what shook me was that this was more than a debate about aid effectiveness. I was seeing the emergence of a different way of thinking about human sexuality and human nature, about what is good or bad for someone, and possibly about whether we can speak meaningfully about these things. While I had learned to be supple, innovative, and accommodating as a public servant, there are limits, or should be. I had, in this case, reached mine, and in doing so, was getting a glimpse of a future that looked more difficult for a Catholic public servant to navigate. Before I get to my conclusions, allow me to share one other story from my Chinese past. Early in my posting to Beijing, I bumped into a Vincentian priest I had known years earlier in Taipei. His question for me was simple. Could we offer space in the embassy for a Sunday Mass for the international Catholic community? The problem for the community was that an increasingly confident and assertive China was again cracking down on the Church. In 2007, Pope Benedict wrote a wonderful letter to Chinese Catholics in which he had encouraged a spirit of reconciliation between the official patriotic Church and both the loyal underground Church and the universal Church beyond China's borders. But the early shoots of this warming trend were quickly trampled by the Communist Party. Bishops and priests came under aggressive forms of surveillance and control. Foreign Catholics who had begun to attend Mass in officially sanctioned churches with some degree of confidence were no longer feeling at home there. And those who lived in Beijing's sprawling outer reaches, who couldn't get to official churches with their children, were finding it much more difficult to book space for Mass in hotels or in the community centers of various expat enclaves. Function rooms would be reserved, but the bookings would be mysteriously cancelled at the last minute. I thought about this for some time. It was the fall of 2010, and I reflected carefully on the visit of Pope Benedict to the United Kingdom, which was happening at that time, a visit that offered an inspiring rationale for the ongoing relevance of religion in the public square. Opening up the embassy for Mass when no other space was available seemed a good example of the kind of thing that he was talking about. But still I pondered. You have to be very careful in official life when you make a decision that ultimately benefits you in private life. This went on for some weeks until Janet, as she often does, encouraged me. In a matter that did not, by the way, meet my standards of diplomacy, she encouraged me to move from reflection to action. I pulled together a group of Catholics in the embassy, and together we formed a committee to support the Mass. We volunteered our labor to set up and take down the chairs required to receive several hundred visitors each Sunday, and we arranged to recover the cost that was required to mount additional security to screen the heavy flow of guests. The response was very enthusiastic. Our parish, Our Lady of China, supported many good local causes, including helping abandoned seniors in communities around Beijing and helping many of the workers and their families who come without official papers to work on the construction projects all over the city. The Church also kept the foreign Catholic population connected to the Universal Church. I was proud to welcome international visitors to the embassy and thought that our Mass spoke eloquently to Canada's support for religious freedom. We offered a similar welcome to other religious denominations for their services, but had no takers. Foreign believers of other faiths were generally better treated than Catholics. Mass with that special parish community remains one of my happiest memories of China. I felt that at the end of my career, my personal life and my professional life were coming back together, that I was coming home. But my happiness wasn't unclouded. We were able to welcome Catholics from every corner of the world but one. I was not able to welcome Chinese citizens to the Mass. Doing this would have been a contravention of Chinese law, imperiling the Chinese participant, the priest, and the Mass itself. But there was more. I was also recognizing my duty as the public servant I had never ceased to be. I wouldn't just be breaking the law as a private citizen, but as a public one, Canada's official representative to China. I had put my hand on a Bible too, and was bound to serve a Canadian public that extended beyond my Catholic community. As I put it in my book, I wasn't the ambassador of the Republic of David Mulroney, as totally cool as that would be. It wasn't an easy decision to make, and I prayed that the Chinese who clustered to peer through the gates as visitors filed in for Mass, or as we assembled for events like our Palm Sunday procession, would be prompted to ask questions and investigate. I hoped that we might be creating a space, albeit tiny, for faith to enter. Let me try to draw some broad conclusions from these remarks and offer something like a concluding to-do list for us to consider. First, For Christians, there's no escaping the call to service. The call comes from two directions. On the one hand, while society may not always accept our explanation as to why we serve, it values the service. We should serve because we're good at it. Christians represent a human resource that the world needs, whether it acknowledges it or not. The call in the other direction is more profound, indeed impossible for us to ignore, because it comes repeatedly from the lips and the example of Christ himself. And if anyone can find the passage where our Lord also said that service would be easy or widely appreciated, or if it got too difficult, we could slip away to sulk in our splendid Christian isolation, if you can find that passage, please share it with me after the talk. Second, we will almost certainly be faced with more situations that leave us in an uncomfortable minority position on what society sees as the wrong side of the democratic divide. But that doesn't mean that we should interpret that as banishing us from the ranks of the servants and forbidding us to share our gift of service. Let's remind ourselves that while we may feel embattled, the public agenda is still broadly open to us, but we have to be willing and able to embrace it. This becomes easier if our first impulse is not suspicion or fear or antagonism, but charity. Early in his pontificate, Pope Francis let us in on a little secret. The world out there isn't a strident mob of powerful and unfairly disadvantaged opponents, so much as it is a field hospital full of wounded and demoralized brothers and sisters. We have many opportunities to serve. Our list of Christian priorities includes service to the poor, the imprisoned, and those who have been driven from their homes. In a talk given at Regis College last week, Jesuit Father James Martin reminded us that the Holy Family were refugees. Jesus was a refugee. And in Laudato Si, Pope Francis has called us all to think about how materialism, greed, and a naive faith in technology have combined to threaten our planet, with the poor as the first and most vulnerable victims. But I'm not going to stand here and tell you that Catholic public servants can anticipate the broad sunlit uplands of societal approval and support in all areas. We need to face up to the growing divide over life issues, the long-standing confrontation over abortion, and the looming one over euthanasia and assisted suicide. This is a challenging reality for many elected officials, for domestic public servants with responsibilities for a broad range of social services, and for Canadian diplomats and aid experts who look at these issues from a global perspective. The space available for those who can't sign on to what appears to be a widespread public preference for, that word again, choice, is getting smaller by the day. Catholic public servants, at least those who try to follow Catholic teaching, are almost automatically on the other side of the democratic divide. Worse, there's a growing tendency to argue that the debate is over, and that in some important cases, public service is only available to those who accept this. Witness the position taken by the Federal Liberal Party in the last election. The situation in this respect is dire, but not without rays, faint and distant, of hope and possibility. To paraphrase my parents, God equipped us, or more correctly, equipped you, with large and powerful brains. They need to be used. Consider the example of Thomas More, who used his brilliant legal mind to defend himself and his conscience. We need to think things through with an idea to our public and democratic responsibilities, which are not unimportant or to be given up lightly, but also with a clear sense of our values, the things that define us, the things that are non-negotiable. We also need to accept the fact that the difference may ultimately prove unbridgeable. Remember that Henry VIII ultimately brought More, for all his legal skill, to the place where, as Robert Bolt reminds us, he located his very self. He was ultimately faced with an existential question. But let's also remember that there are many steps and decision points before such fundamental decisions have played out. There are many chances to bring to bear a policy perspective that has been enriched by Christian tradition, chances to ask that other options be considered or a broader range of experts be consulted, particularly on issues as important as those relating to human life. I am not naively suggesting here that such arguments are easy to present to an increasingly secular and skeptical audience, much less that they will succeed, but they have no chance if they have no champions. Sometimes simply having the courage to raise alternative views serves to keep the discussion alive and protects the space for principled and legitimate dissent. What is most essential is to challenge attempts to deny the possibility of this alternative view, to challenge attempts to cut off debate. It helps enormously if in doing this, we're able to bring to bear the full power and beauty of the Catholic intellectual tradition, which encourages a sweeping, comprehensive, and thoroughly connected worldview. Our defense of life is intrinsically and organically connected to our defense of the poor and of the planet. Now, this job almost certainly is beyond the scope and ability of most public servants working alone, although there was one servant who was doing an exemplary job of this, and I refer, of course, to the Holy Father. While even he may not be able to sway broader public opinion, his voice and that of others helped to create a space and respect for what I would refer to as Catholic conscientious objection. This is, admittedly, the fallback position, the last line of defense, given that beheading is no longer the punishment for seemingly recalcitrant public servants. It is, in fact, an alternative that the Holy Father himself endorsed and spoke about on his return from America. It may be the possibility, the safe space that enables Catholic public servants who have responsibilities in these areas to continue to serve on those files and areas that remain open to them. But we need to struggle to win even that space. I often think of the example of Quaker and Mennonite conscientious objectors in time of war. Their refusal to serve on grounds of conscience was, I think, a benefit to more souls than their own. Their conscientious objection created a sense of awareness and some uneasiness in the general public, even a wartime public filled with patriotic fervor. If these good, hard-working, and courageous people think that killing other people, even our enemies, is wrong, why is that? But again, we will not be allowed even that small space reserved for conscientious objectors unless and until we can communicate our broader agenda of love and service. We are not heedless of the plight of pregnant women or of the sufferings of the old or infirm. Our first impulse is not to judge, but to serve, to heal, and to love. But the scope of that service, like the target of that healing and that love, is broad and inclusive. So who beyond the shining example of Pope Francis can help create that space for Catholic public servants? How can we enable them to continue to serve by protecting their freedom of conscience, protecting their right to opt out of decisions, actions, and policies that they consider to be wrong? As I was thinking about this, I was trying to come up with a list of people and organizations that I could task with useful activities before saying goodnight and going home. But in doing so, I was troubled by the annoying realization that, as president of a Catholic university, the list probably includes me. So let me close by offering 3 things that I'd like us to do at St. Michael's. First, we can continue to explore complex moral and ethical issues, bringing what Father Peter Bisson of Regis College refers to as a discerning integrity to our examination of the theological principles that underpin our position. It occurs to me that Canadians may not always agree with our views, but they expect us to have views. And in this time of tumultuous change, would feel comforted by the awareness that there's a thoughtful alternative to a general tendency to elevate the individual above all things. Second, and related to this, is the need for witness, the public presentation of the Christian perspective. I was recently in a meeting with a colleague from another Catholic university who talked about a public position taken by a division of that university. This position directly challenged Catholic teaching on an important moral issue. There was a pause and then a general murmur of support among other colleagues, all in the world of Catholic education, for what was presented as a necessary defense of academic freedom. But what occurred to me afterward was that we are sometimes better at defending and protecting critical, but ultimately fairly mainstream voices than we are at sharing a Catholic moral and intellectual perspective that is truly, distinctively, and admittedly in these days, disruptively different. Isn't that a freedom worth defending? Third, there is certainly more we can do, perhaps via continuing education, to support the coming generation of Catholic public servants, the Catholic leaders who will be taking the national and global stage in the next decades. Can we help by identifying and clarifying issues, sharing best practices, helping to create networks, and invoking inspiring examples? Can we seek out or encourage similar initiatives in other provinces, in the US, or in the wider world? Think of things like an introductory course for aspiring Catholic leaders, or a mid-career refresher course on ethical behavior for public servants and others navigating a seemingly featureless ethical landscape. Now, I made the mistake of finishing my presentation by giving myself more homework. This is a discussion worth continuing and an intellectual vineyard where many laborers are needed. Good ideas are always welcome. It's not as if we don't have a rich tradition to draw on. The thing that connected my office at the PCO, the Pearson Building, the Afghanistan Task Force, the Canadian Embassy in Beijing, and now at St. Mike's is, aside from my own distinguished presence, a reproduction of Holbein's famous picture of Thomas More. Brilliant lawyer, distinguished Lord Chancellor, the King's good servant, but God's first. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those words, Mr. Mulroney. I now open up the floor for some questions you may have.
Hi, Mr. Mulroney. Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering, when you did some, I guess not so recent anymore, book on Catholic universities, Jackie Costa notes that in order for a university to be truly Catholic, they need to engage in what he calls true pluralism by debating and intellectually offering opportunities for dialectic and whatnot with non-Catholic universities. I was wondering if St. Mike's was going to have any of that.
I certainly hope so, and we'll be looking at doing that. And by the way, one of the things I used to warn against and defend against when I was in government was intellectual piracy. I take copious notes every time I come to the Newman Center on how to do things, but in terms not just of the discussions in our classroom, but especially in terms of the public presentation of alternative views. And if I could be critical of my own institution and others, I don't think we've been as robust as we need to, and we've tended to sort of focus on one end of the spectrum. I think there are real pressures in a university setting in presenting that broader view. And the danger is, if you succumb to those pressures and you adopt that habit of only hewing to sort of one side of the spectrum, or only presenting or only exhibiting tolerance of one set of views, it becomes increasingly hard for you to aspire to something more. So that's a challenge that I want us to take up at St. Michael's, and that's going to mean some hard work at actually identifying people and bringing people in. So that work has begun, but we'll also look to partner with folks like Newman, Ryerson, with others in the Archdiocese, to bring, because if those voices aren't heard, that space that I've talked about diminishes, gets increasingly smaller. Yes?
Could you mention any experience if that happened when you were in the foreign service in China or in South Korea, being able to help with the Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA, funds to the diplomatic work and projects to develop that really have a big impact on poor people?
Sure. Let me tell you one totally unrelated story, because you mentioned Korea, and it reminds me of something. So we were in Korea in the 1980s, early 1980s, and our house was about 3 or 4 miles from the embassy in the old university district, the old district of Seoul National University. And right behind our house was a very large Catholic center. In Korea, unlike Japan, Korea's Christian population was well above 20%. And it so happened that John Paul II came to Korea while we were there. And as I was walking home from work one night, I saw the crowds lining the street, and I saw the Pope-mobile coming. And as he got closer, I felt tears streaming down my cheeks. I thought, I'm a very loyal Catholic, I like John Paul II, but I didn't expect to be so emotional. Well, I had actually been tear-gassed, because at that time, if any visitor came, and Reagan came, and the Secretary General of the UN came, and any visitor, all the students came out to protest against the government, and the response was to spray pepper fog. Now, they weren't protesting John Paul II, they were just protesting because it was a big event, and I kind of caught wind of that. So there was a little bit of real emotion, but a little bit of extra. And if I am sometimes critical of CETA, I should also, and thank you for giving me the chance to acknowledge some of the good work they did. They frustrated me sometimes because I thought that their presence in China was controversial. There was a famous cover of The Economist that showed a Chinese rocket, the Chinese space program, and the caption was, why does China get development assistance? And as soon as people in CETA saw that in the last government, they were very afraid that they'd be criticized. The reason CETA was necessary in China was, as quickly as China was developing, that development left many people behind. Some people just because they couldn't get at them, it was just happening, the cities were growing too quickly. Others, like Tibetans and Uyghurs, Muslim Uyghurs in the far west, because they were not very high on the policy agenda. But there was one really great project that I really admired, and that was CETA worked in South China in support of migrant women. So young women who would leave their villages and come to South China, to Guangzhou, used to be called Canton, to get work. And very often, these people would be exploited by their employers because they were young women from the villages. What did they know? They would pay them less, treat them poorly, and they were so afraid of losing their job that they'd submit to this. And one of the things that was changing in China that was really interesting was CETA came up with this idea, and it wasn't as if Canada was standing on a soapbox saying, we have these great ideas, China, come and listen. They worked with the All China Women's Federation, they worked with the governments, because there are good people in government in China who don't want to see that exploitation. They even worked with the railways, and the railways said, well, we often see young women on our trains heading to the big city. If we think they're at risk, could we give them a pamphlet? We said, yes. So it was a wonderful partnership. What frustrated me, though, was because CETA was in this crouch, this defensive crouch, they would never talk about the project. And at one point, somebody from CETA said, look, the Toronto Star reported on our project, and Canada wasn't mentioned. And I said, I don't think that's a victory. I'd like Chinese people to know that we're actually succeeding. So what happened was the former Governor General, Michael Jean, came to China. And I was able to kind of influence her program a little bit, so I added in that she would go to this center for migrant women, and people didn't sort of catch on to it until it was too late. And it was a remarkable event, because Michael Jean, being a great communicator, just told Canada's story in China so perfectly. The day before, I'd seen her at Fudan University with the elite students of China, young men and young women on the fast track, and she charmed them with her stories of coming to Canada and talking about her struggles, and she was magnificent. Then we went to this kind of factory district where all these young women talked to her, and at first they were very nervous. Who's this person? What's this all about? The very term in Chinese, Governor General, Zongdu. The Chinese, what do you have? Who is this person? He said, oh, it represents the British Crown. I said, what? And so it's very hard to explain the Governor General to Canadians, let alone to Chinese. But we just said, take our word for it. You'll like her. So she went in and talked to these students, and she broke down their inhibitions. She said, you know what? My family came to Canada, and we were very poor, and we struggled, and in some parts of Canada there was even some racism, but we dealt with it. And then my dream was to become a broadcaster, and it was a wonderful, wonderful experience, and a kind of very emblematic of what CETA was trying to do and what Canada was trying to do. And then, to make matters even better, Michael Jean went out and spoke to reporters about what Canada and China were doing together. So there were times when CETA really got it right and could really do the right thing. There were also, really good NGOs in China. So one of the ones that I really liked was called Jinde, and it was a Catholic NGO in the city of Shijiazhuang, which is the city where Norman Bethune, where his monument is, close to where he died fighting the Japanese. And so this Catholic NGO worked with HIV/AIDS patients. They provided counseling. They provided assistance to the elderly. And I got interested in them because attached to the NGO was a seminary. And at the time of this Chinese crackdown, after Pope Benedict had warmed things up and made things possible, and then the party began to crack down again, they'd actually imposed a party leader, a party hack, a communist official, to be the head of the seminary. And what really impressed me was the seminarians went on strike. they went out and said, well, we're not going to work. And so the Chinese said, how can you, they're on strike, what are we going to do about it? So they finally had to they're very pragmatic. They know when they're losing a public relations issue. So they got this guy out and they brought a real priest back into the seminary. But I wanted to go and see them. And I did get to see them. And I got to know them. And when I did things in China, especially if I was going to try to see some Tibetans or Uyghurs or go to a house church, I would do that in the sort of quiet part of my program. When I said I need some downtime, then I'd go off and do that because I couldn't ask the government officials who tailed me all the time if I could do that. So on this one occasion, I wanted to go see the priests at Jinda. So I called them up and they said, David, most welcome, please come, but don't come without getting permission because we'll get in trouble and it'll bring the authorities down on our heads. So please get permission. So I called the local foreign affairs office of the city, which is, by the way, bigger than Toronto. And I said, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, but I'm also going to see those priests at Jinda. Well, why do you want to go see them? And we had this back and forth. I said, so I'm going to see those priests. Your ambassador, when he travels around Canada, can go anywhere he wants. Well, it could be dangerous. And so finally they said, yes, you can go. So it was going to be my first call. So I get to the train station, the train pulls in, and there's a junior guy from the foreign ministry, and he said, you're not going to see those priests. It's off. The visit's off. And the priests were there, and they were kind of embarrassed by his histrionics, and said, you have to see a really important person downtown, so there's no time. And I said, well, when exactly do I have to go downtown? And he said, well, you've got to be there in 45 minutes. And I said, well, I still have 15 minutes that I can get there in 15 minutes, see it, and then go. And I brought, because I'd learned that, and this may be true of priests, nuns, and seminarians elsewhere, they liked Canadian cookies and cakes. So I brought a whole bunch of cookies and cakes. So I literally ran through throwing cakes and cookies at people. And I saw the rector of the seminary, and he brought me into his office and said, David, I want to show you something. And there was his picture. He couldn't show it outside, but there was his picture of Pope Benedict. And he said, we're official, we have to apply all the rules, but in our hearts, we're loyal to the Universal Church. And I saw one of his priests not so long ago. He came to Toronto, and he said, we remember those cookies. So you just never know. You never know what the impact you can have.
Cookies open doors.
Cookies always open doors. People never say no. Any other questions? One and two. Yes, sir.
So maybe I should stand over here so everyone can see.
Sure, or you need to use this.
I'm too afraid. Okay. So I hope not to put you in an uncomfortable position. I don't think I'm asking this question about, because I'm not going to ask for your opinion on a public issue. But when I was a student member of the board of student union at UTM in Mississauga, I often had to, as a Catholic, try to decide how to promote a view that I had in face of values that were against our Catholic teaching. So, since you're in a similar, much more responsibility, of course, position at St. Michael's College as the president. Say there is a project that students propose, or maybe even the university proposes, maybe a branch of government proposes to be implemented, maybe not only at St. Michael's College, but around, and say it definitely goes against what our values would be, not only as Catholics, but as you mentioned, larger scope of good for other people. Where is that line where it would be okay for a Catholic to say, well, it's not me saying yes or authorizing it or pushing it forward, and I can maybe say it's them, I can only do my duty as an appointed president of the college. And when you already cross that line and are probably doing something that as a Catholic maybe you shouldn't do it, you should object to your conscience.
That's a fantastic question and a really good one. Let me just say, first of all, it's much harder for you on your own at UTM to stand up for things than it is for me at a Catholic college where I've reinforced and I've got all kinds of people around me and supporting. So full credit. This issue, well, there are a couple of manifestations of it. To be very honest, I used to get a little frustrated listening to Catholic politicians in Ottawa who'd say things like, I took this very courageous stand against the church because, I'm not afraid. Actually, was it that courageous? if the church, are you more worried about the church or the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, Maclean's Magazine, the CBC? I mean, these positions are not all that courageous sometimes that they take. I think what happens and what's important is that you have to offer your view. You have to give your opinion. You have to give your opinion because your witness needs to be heard, and people need to remember that there's this diversity of views out there, that there are other ways of looking at things. It has to be done very diplomatically and with a lot of charity and compassion, but you need to keep that space for legitimate dissent. And what I worry about, in my position, if you ignore something or don't speak to it because you want to be considerate and kind and you don't want to disrupt an event, you've not only missed a teaching moment, you've taught something else, that that these issues don't matter. So sometimes it means creating a little bit of unpleasantness or ruining the consensus at an event by saying there's a different view, there's a wider view, and this is where I come from. And it's not easy. That's why I talked about in some of the coursework, trying to build networks, trying to have people who can reinforce you so that you know you're not alone. When I was your age, the world was different, and I had all kinds of reinforcers, who said the same things. I saw this reflected back at me in the media and in much of the press, and so it's much harder now. I think that landscape is, as I say, close to being featureless. So I admire you for what you've done. Not easy, but it's still absolutely essential, because every time as we get quieter and quieter, that space is diminished. And most dangerous of all are the people who say you can't even raise these issues. It's not acceptable to raise these issues. We've got to keep that space alive. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Matthew. I'm a student at Regis College. I think your talk tonight raised some very interesting questions about conscience. And
Yes.
I think underlying that is a realization that there's a change in human anthropology, or our understanding of what it means to be human. You've quoted 3 Jesuits tonight. I'd like to quote a 4th. He also spent some time in the East, and he said that in the church, Africa has the life, Europe has the truth, and Asia has the way. With your experience in China, do they have a different understanding of what it means to be human? And how can that enrich our understanding as we study it here? One of the problems I see here is that in the West we're tending to emphasize a more scientific mindset. We're moving away from the humanities. And the humanities that we did study were largely just Western, and it didn't take into account any of the wisdom in the East. Have you managed to see anything in your travels or experience, of especially what it means to be human, and maybe where there could be some convergences with the Catholic understanding of that?
Well, China is an interesting place, but in many respects it's a sad place, because it's also a society that has, for 70 years, essentially denied any possibility of the transcendent or the spiritual, and that has a devastating effect on generations of people. When I'd see very senior, very competent, highly placed diplomatic officials in Beijing, and they'd actually spit out the syllables, Vatican, Vatican, as if this little enclave in the middle of a European city could threaten this nuclear-armed, country of 1.3 billion people. So the capacity even to understand that perspective has been reduced. So the kind of spiritual China of the ages is hard to find, but it exists. Janet and I had a great opportunity, along with Aiden, our son, to travel to Dunhuang in the southwest of China. It's on the Silk Road. And Dunhuang is notable for its caves, carved out of the kind of soft rock of the ranges. And because it's on the Silk Road, it's a place where Buddhism entered China. So the first caves from about the 2nd and 3rd centuries show Buddha as an Indian, and he wears Indian dress and he looks very Indian. The later caves, the 7th and 8th century, Buddha looks very Chinese. So Buddhism is moving and changing. And one of the things I'd say because the Chinese were always, they want to sinicize the church. They want to say, this is a Chinese church, this is, and I'd say, well, look, religions move. I've gone to Mass, in Cambodian, I've gone to Mass in Poland and in Italy and Ireland. I mean, I've never thought about the nationality of the priest. It doesn't matter. So these hang-ups are not all that helpful. But the problem with modern China is this pervasive, from government, secular spirit, and one that very much reduces people to sort of economic units. And things that benefit the 100 million people are justified. Things that crush 100 are just necessary on the road to political change. So spiritual growth at the level of the party isn't there. The party actually fears what's happening among regular people in China. So you have the emergence of house churches in Protestant communities. So house churches are churches not controlled by the government, not controlled by SARA, State Administration of Religious Affairs, which insists that it kind of, after the successful communist takeover at the end of the Civil War, it brought all the Protestant churches together and said, you're going to be one Protestant church. This is the official state church. So now you get people in Beijing or in the far west of China who want to read their Bibles and sing hymns and get together with their small communities and don't want to be organized that way. And the church, or the government is trying to stop this. There were big demonstrations in Beijing, and I used to find that our locally engaged Chinese staff tended to know an awful lot about the house churches, and they'd kind of wink as they tell you, because they were members of the house churches. So the party's worried about this because many of the people who work for the party are also members of the church. And I remember on another instance going to Chengdu in Western China, and what's happened in that part of China because of the Chinese clampdown in Tibet is, prior to 1949, Tibet's windows on the outer world were all in India and Burma. The cities that Tibetans went to and the cities that brought them news of the outside world were Rangoon and Calcutta and places like this. Now it's Chongqing and Chengdu and the place, it's all in China. So when I was in Chengdu one time, I went for a walk through the Tibetan town with an American of Tibetan origin. And he was showing me, street after street of shops and restaurants and all kinds of Tibetan people, lots of security. And I noticed a great many shops manufacturing and selling artifacts for temples, statues of the Buddha, candle holders, magnificent objects. And I said, what's this for? Who's buying? He said, well, it's for the temples of the Tibetan region, which goes far beyond Tibet in Western China, and it's paid for by Han Chinese, some of them the spouses of senior party officials. They're rejecting even the Buddhism that's permitted in the main part of China, the traditional Chinese Buddhism. They're interested in Tibetan Buddhism because it seems more alive to them. So there's a resurgence in Tibetan Buddhism, there's a resurgence in Christianity, and then there's this manifestation of Islam, particularly in the far west, that the party simply doesn't understand. So it fears this. So China's not really in touch with its spiritual side, and the party is struggling to control this popular manifestation. Final point is, the one safe channel that the party saw was the rehabilitation of someone who had been really demonized in the Cultural Revolution, and that's Confucius. So Confucius could be made safe because he becomes someone who's tied to China's past, is very much for education and the family, so he seemed to be kind of controllable and safe. And even though he'd been demonized in the Cultural Revolution, maybe this is a safety valve for this spirituality. And to show you how funny political movements can be in China, nothing was said about this, but suddenly in Tiananmen Square, which is the most political part of Beijing, if you're going to send a message, you do it in Tiananmen Square, there's a gigantic statue of Confucius. Just one morning, people arrive and there's Confucius. How did he get there? Nobody knows. But so suddenly people, and the Chinese are very good at reading messages, okay? So the government's telling us something. What is it? Well, maybe it's that Confucius is making a comeback. Janet and I had gone to the birthplace of Confucius in Chufu. And the park near the ancestral home of that family is full of memorial tablets to Confucius, all of them with a crack at about this level, where people in the Cultural Revolution went in with sledgehammers and cracked it. So gone from being demonized to suddenly people are saying, oh, we better start studying Confucius. This is really important. And there's, in fact, one of the kind of prophets of the new Confucianism is a Canadian guy named Daniel Bell from McGill University. But then, people said, okay, Confucius, and they got really interested in Confucius, and then the party said, this might be a little too strong. So the next, like a month later, it disappeared. And it's now hidden in a courtyard of the main museum. So the party struggles to come to terms with spirituality. When Mary Kay Cosmetics came to China, normally companies, when they enter China, have to go through the Ministry of Commerce. Mary Kay, I think, has kind of messianic, sales meetings, revival style sales meetings. It pumps up its sales force. And so Mary Kay had to go through the State Administration of Religious Affairs because it was a motivator. So there's a great book, if you haven't read it, is called The Picture Palace of Matteo Ricci. And it's a book about, Jonathan Spence wrote it, and it's really an account of the great Jesuit Matteo Ricci, and the main sort of storyline of the book is about that technique used in medieval times and in the Renaissance to memorize, creating a house in your mind and putting objects. So Matteo Ricci creates his house in his mind, and in each room he puts another Chinese character until he has this incredible understanding. But the book is about his efforts to. His vision was that he would win converts if he went to the very highest levels of society. If he could get to the emperor, he could then convince Chinese people. And what he found instead, he never got to the emperor, although the emperor knew of his presence and gave the land on which the cathedral now stands. But he had very tough going, and it's quite interesting. One of the things that Ricci found was the idea of the crucified Christ was very difficult for people in Chinese society to understand. They looked at this and said, that seems like something that would happen to a criminal. We don't understand this. And they were so shocked by the image that came to them very suddenly that it was an impediment also. But what he found was that images of the Blessed Virgin, and remember, he'd have maybe 2 books in his possession, and he'd have to wait another 18 months or 2 years for a book to come from Italy to replace the one he'd given away. But images of the Blessed Virgin reminded Chinese people of Guan Yin, the goddess of mercy, that manifestation of mercy in Buddhism. So he used Guan Yin and Our Lady as a way of bringing people into their understandings. But it was tough sledding for Matteo Ricci. Great man, but tough sledding. There's maybe time for one more question. So now, you should tell me so now. If there is one, yes, ma'am.
My background is non-Catholic Christian.
Yes.
So there's something that puzzles me all the time. When I'm conversing with somebody and I say, well, I'm a Christian, and people have often said, no, I'm Catholic. So that's always puzzled me because my understanding of Christian is an umbrella, and under it are the Protestants, Catholics, and so on. And I was mentioned by the title today, the topic, the vocation of a Christian in public life, not even say Catholic. So actually I came here not that, I'm anti-Catholic, but I'm pleasantly surprised. And I just want your definition. If I talk to you and ask you, are you Christian? Would you say no, I'm Catholic?
And sorry, just out of my sense of unworthiness as an ecumenist, I said that at the outset that I'd spend more time on my own perspective on Christianity, and I very much would say that as a Catholic, I'm a Christian, although I struggle to be both. But there's a very interesting thing in China. This is an area where the Jesuits, who normally have the best ideas, regretted their early success. So the first Christian presence and significant Christian presence was the Jesuits. So then comes the fateful opportunity, the fateful question in China, well, what are we going to call you? What is this thing? And so they came up with a very evocative name, Qianzhu Jiao, followers of the heavenly path, Catholics. So if you go to China now and they say, what are you? First, they get totally mixed up. But if you say Qianzhu Jiao, they have a sense of that. So, and then they'll say, oh, but that other person is Christian. So you're not a Christian, because the Protestant missionaries who came second outdid the Jesuits because they went for the simple, straightforward Jidu Jiao, followers of Jesus, Christian. So for Chinese people get endlessly confused. They say, did you say you were a Christian or a Catholic? It's the same thing. The only time I was ever asked in public life about my religion was in China. And we had a social media presence on what's called Weibo, which is like Twitter in China. We ended up having several 100,000 followers, and it was a great way for us to tell our story, to reach out. And I'd talk about my travels in China. Interestingly, only a few times did I ever get really negative feedback from our followers. And we said, by the way, we'll tell the story of Canada, we'll answer honestly. If you have criticisms, we'll leave them up. As long as they're not hurtful to people. And so we kept all this stuff up. So only 2 times did I ever get really negative feedback. One time was when I went to see a dairy in China, a huge dairy up in Mongolia, where they were processing milk to serve, provide to families all throughout China. Great demand. And they had wanted to find out about Canadian dairy cattle. So as soon as we heard about that, I trundled off to Mongolia to preach the virtues of Canadian dairy cattle. And I talked about my trip to the dairy, and they said, Chinese followers afterwards said, that's a very bad place, you shouldn't go there, because prior to the Olympics, there had been a terrible scandal in China involving tainted milk. And Chinese dairies, to cut their costs, had spiked their powdered milk with melamine, and hundreds of thousands of babies had got sick. So I used that as an opportunity to say, we think that cooperation with Canada would actually be a good thing, et cetera, et cetera. So it was an interesting exchange. The other time I got a really negative, though, was, and this happened several times, if ever I tweeted that I'd gone to a mosque, I'd get negative responses from people saying, why are you going to see those people? They're kind of troublemakers, and And so I would turn that and talk about my own experience as an outsider, and how one of the things that I really enjoyed about mosques in China was seeing how they also incorporated Chinese architecture, and it would be a way to kind of change the discussion. But anyway, on one occasion, we had a lot of, I was answering questions from our Chinese followers, and I had a lot of my Canadian embassy colleagues around the table with me. So suddenly one of the Chinese followers said, do you believe in Jesus Christ? And it's a wonderful question to be asked. It's one that is never asked in Ottawa in the Canadian Public Service. And so I looked around the table and I just watched as heads kind of came up very sheepishly. And I said, I do. That's the central belief in my life. And they said, so you are a Christian? I said, I am a Christian. So I answered the question that time, and I think I gave the right answer. Thank you. Thank you very much.
David, on behalf of all of us here at the Newman Center, we'd like to thank you for the honesty by which you shared all of your experiences. You've given thoughts to consider and also words of empowerment, not only for those of us discerning a career in public service, but also for all of us as citizens of a democratic country. Thank you.
Thank you so much.